Hi guys, here to talk to you a little bit today about scene 2, which we read in class. Sitting in my living room, dogs, well there's one there too, so they might run around a little bit. But scene 2, we've met our main characters. We've met Stanley, we've met Blanche, and we've met Stella. Scene 2 is where we start to learn a little bit more about the relationship between these characters. Issues that come up in scene 2 that I want to talk about today. And we're definitely going to talk a little bit about the boys' night versus the girls' night, that we have these two kind of conflicting events happening. Talk a little bit too about Stella's pregnancy, which is an issue that comes up in this chapter that's going to be incredibly important in the book, in the story. We also have to address the tension between Blanche and Stanley, that they very nearly come to blows in this scene. And I want to talk a little bit too about the reaction that Blanche has to Stella's pregnancy. So these are some of the issues we're going to address in the video. So Stanley's having some friends over for a poker night, and Stella is taking Blanche out of the apartment. She says that I don't know how she would take it, this idea of all of these men, especially these maybe lower middle class men, coming over, playing poker, drinking in the apartment. Blanche has this air of superiority, this idea that men should behave a certain way and women should behave a certain way. And we get the idea here that Stanley and his friends are maybe a little bit rough. That kind of echoes back to scene 1 with Stanley throwing the meat and the men arguing and joking. So Stella is actually going to remove Blanche from the situation and take her out to eat and maybe go to a little music place afterwards. So we get the idea that the boys' night in is going to be pretty rowdy, pretty loud and boisterous, and the girls are just going to go out to dinner and kind of have a very pleasant evening out. Now, in this scene, Williams introduces the symbolism of bathing, that Stanley and Stella are having this conversation out in the main part of the apartment about how Belle Reeve has been lost, and Blanche is in the bathroom, in the bathtub, singing a song, and she's singing about the land of the sky blue water, they brought a captive maid. This idea that while Stanley and Stella are in the main part of the house talking about real issues, the loss of Belle Reeve, Stella's pregnancy, Blanche is in the bathroom, in the bathtub, singing about some fairy tale and captive land. So this is our very first time that we're going to see Blanche bathing. It's going to come up in almost every single scene, but it's also showing us a little bit about how Blanche is kind of off in her own little world. She doesn't really want to or have to deal with the reality. She's leaving that to Stanley and Stella to deal with. Now, Stanley seems to be having kind of a hard time understanding how Belle Reeve has been lost. He says, "What do you mean? It was sold? It's gone?" And Stella says, "No, it was lost. Something happened to it and we've lost the house." And Stanley doesn't accept that answer. He feels like he's being cheated. And he starts to talk about the Napoleonic Code, which states that what belongs to the wife belongs to the husband and vice versa. And he says that something has gone wrong here, that Blanche has swindled them. He even goes as far as to start going through her things. He says he's looking for papers. But he starts pulling out her clothes, and he pulls out her fur, and he pulls out her costume jewelry, and he says, "Look at all of this. How could she even afford this on a teacher's salary?" This idea that she's maybe sold the house and has, used the money to buy these things, to pay for things. And Stella says, those aren't real. Those are costume jewels. That's an old fur that someone gave her. And Stanley gets kind of upset by this. He's been fooled by her finery, that it's not real. And Stanley kind of gets very defensive about this. And we'll see this. Whenever Stanley feels like he's being mistreated or he feels like something's wrong, he gets very angry, almost violent, the way he throws things across the room. Now, Stanley does not like to be bossed around. When Stella tells him that he's being an idiot, he gets angry. When she tells him that he needs to compliment Blanche, he becomes furious that every time she tries to give him directions, he does the exact opposite. She says, go outside. And he goes, no. And he sits down at the table. And she says, be nice to Blanche. So, of course, he's immediately rude to Blanche. That Stanley and Stella, for all of their meat-throwing passion in scene 1, also tend to argue quite a bit. And here we have again in scene 2 the changing of clothes out in the open. That Blanche is in a red silk robe and she's going to put on her dress, and Stanley doesn't leave. He just sits there. She goes, well, if you're going to stay, then you can help me with my buttons. And again, students have always commented on how odd this is, that Stanley won't give her any privacy and she doesn't go back into the bathroom to change. So there's this kind of weird tension between Stanley and Blanche. Is something going on here? What's happening? And Blanche is definitely a flirt. That she does tend to flirt with men. She does act kind of like the dainty Southern belle. And she's doing that to Stanley, even though that's her brother-in-law. Stanley even says, if I didn't know that you was my wife's sister, I'd get ideas about you. So again, back this tension, this kind of chemistry between Blanche and Stanley. And of course, Stanley, being the aggressor, being someone who likes to push buttons, pushes Blanche a little bit too far. He starts going through her things again. And when he reaches these love letters, she says, the touch of your hands insults them. That these love letters came from her young husband. We get the idea, too, that these love letters are more than just love letters. That there is something that happened with Blanche's husband. And she says, poems a dead boy wrote. I hurt him the way that you would like to hurt me. But you can't. I'm not young and vulnerable anymore. But my young husband was. And never mind about that. Just give them back to me. This idea that Blanche has hurt people in the past. And she says that Stanley can't hurt her anymore, but he obviously is hurting her, that she's having this very extreme reaction. Him just touching the letters is actually almost physically painful for her. Now, at the end of scene 2, Blanche admits to Stella that she was flirting with Stanley. And Stella doesn't really react the way I think most women would. She just says, all right, let's go this way. Almost like she's used to Blanche doing this kind of thing. Now, as the women walk off into the night, they're going out for the evening, and the men are coming in for the poker game, there's a vendor who will walk across the stage. And the vendor is a tamale vendor, so he has his cart, there'd be steam coming off the cart, and all he says is, red hot. This idea that things in our play are starting to heat up. The tensions are getting hotter, the awkwardness is definitely getting a little bit more noticeable. So that ending note of red hot is quite symbolic. Now, Stella is pregnant. She made a comment earlier in scene 2, and then Stanley kind of spills the beans at the end of the scene. And this is an important point because Stella is bringing a new Kowalski into the world. This child will not be a Dubois. This child will be Stanley's child. It will be raised in New Orleans. It will not be raised at Belle Reve. So once again, we have almost this division of a family here, that Stella is, furthering the Kowalski line while the Dubois line is officially dying out. And dying out, according to Blanche, because of the epic fornications of their uncles and grandfathers and brothers. This idea that Belle Reve, the family name, the Dubois legacy, has been lost because of a mismanagement of desire. She says that 4-letter word, a reference to lust, has cost us everything, that people make bad decisions when they're thinking about desire. So where desire came up in scene 1, it's also now coming up in scene 2.